Alright guys, welcome to this video. We're going to be breaking down the interconnected relationship between flexibility and technique when it comes to kicking. Quite a common thing that tends to happen is when people will see a certain technique performed, they'll see how dynamic and sort of explosive it looks perhaps, and they will think, wow, that must take a huge degree of flexibility to be able to perform. So a really common thing that I tend to notice on this is on YouTube comments if I'm looking through videos of like kicking, or maybe people will message me on social media and saying something like, you know, I want to be able to perform XYZ kick. Any tips on developing the flexibility to be able to do this, with no mention of really anything else. So I think this video should be really useful if you've already got some experience in kicking and you're wanting to improve in something, but perhaps you don't know what's kind of holding your technique back or getting in your way of getting to that next level. Now, I mentioned in a previous video that having a decent level of flexibility is obviously an imperative thing to be able to kick effectively and not get injured and things like that. Usually though, in people when they want to improve, it's not actually the flexibility that's kind of their problem, and the things that they need to work on are kind of a little bit more hidden under the surface. So we'll call that this person's paradigm. So a simple way to describe a paradigm is basically a set of assumptions that we have that influence the way we make our decisions. So in this case, the person who is wanting to improve their kicks paradigm would be that I need to improve my flexibility in order to be able to do this kick. But like most things in life, often the source of what's causing us problems is kind of underneath the surface, which is a little bit tricky to identify because it's not kind of right in front of you and you don't always know where to look for it. And that's the same with this situation. So how this relates to training then is if a person believes they've identified the source of why they're not able to perform in the way they want to, say in terms of our example it's flexibility, they'll be looking at that area and focusing solely upon that, and unfortunately they may never actually look under the surface and discover the real reason of what's kind of causing them problems, or more accurately doing things that are not going to kind of yield them the most benefit for the effort that they're putting in. And the 80-20 principle seems to be some kind of universal law in which 20% of effort tends to yield 80% of results. And this occurs in so many different areas, like for instance how if you want to improve your body composition, it's 80% diet and 20% exercise. And flexibility is exactly the same in that regard. So you could stretch for years and years and years and develop an incredible level of flexibility, but then still have poor kicks with like a hunched posture and not really have any understanding of why. But then you come across somebody who points something out to you and you make a slight tweak to your technique, and then all of a sudden it's like kind of the lights go on in a darkened room and you're suddenly able to do the technique way better than you were for years before. In order to illustrate this point in a second, we're going to look at a clip that one of the viewers sent me of his spin hook kick, and he was looking for some tips on how to improve it to make it much more kind of side on and controlled as he was coming round. So as you can see, his kick isn't bad by any means. He's got very good control over his body and good rotational force going round. But in order to really get that side on turned hip position, what he's doing here is he's going too far round with his pivoted foot. This is the starting point for which everything else is kind of happening from here. Because his foot's facing this direction, his toes are facing about here and his heel off towards here, it's knocking the alignment of his whole body off into the kick, and he's not able to open his hips correctly. So in this position, it's almost impossible to really turn those hips in the right position, and often people will try and do that and kind of injure themselves by twisting one joint one way and one joint the other way. So the beginning part is all in this pivoted foot. So really, if you wanted to open those hips correctly, you would need to have this heel facing towards the camera and his toes facing backwards more. So that would look more like this one. And you see, as the kicking position happens here, my heel is facing completely towards the camera and it's allowing me to be in that nice, completely opened up position, as opposed to being kind of folded up in this type position, if that makes sense. And once you do that, that gives you much more control over the kick coming through. So then these clips are when he'd applied what I'd mentioned to do with the foot positioning, and literally all he'd done really was change the position of his foot, and it had a knock-on effect to the rest of the whole move and allowed him to much more easily open up his hips into this nice open position and be much more controlled throughout the whole kick. And this pivoting of the foot and the positioning is really one of the most important things that's going to determine how a kick goes afterwards, because it's one of the first things to happen. And it's often the thing when you see somebody who's really struggling to kind of perform kicks with any kind of power and explosiveness. And there's a few basic areas that are really going to go a long way to improving your kicks. And for the sake of ease, we're just going to break these down into two distinct categories. One is things that are part of a technique and a mental conception of what goes into a move. And the second is the physical exercises or drills that you can do to make that technique better. And that is the category that flexibility falls into, but almost everything in that category comes secondary on the list. So this is a point that I keep hammering home all the time, because it's really going to improve your skills exponentially if you're able to grasp it and focus on it. The thing that needs to come first is a conceptual understanding of how a specific technique works, the certain body positions and alignment and things like that. And the reason this comes first is it can be practiced mostly without addition of the second category. So improving things like flexibility and strength and all that kind of stuff can almost be viewed in a sense like add-ons, or what's sometimes known as a force multiplier. So force multipliers are tools that help you amplify your effort to produce more output. But it's obviously really important to have a degree of balance in all areas, and too much of one side will always tip the scales and leave you with problems in other areas. And this is basically the point I'm trying to get across in this video, is that obviously I'm not saying flexibility isn't important and technique is only important. It's a degree of balance, and not to just only think of one area with neglect to the others. And the same thing goes for all of these videos as well. You know, I may present one element of training, but that's by no means intended to be all you need to do. And again, people's paradigms state to them that one thing should take precedence over another. And this goes for many areas in life when we identify with just one side or one pole of a certain binary opposite. And whenever we find ourselves in rigid ultimate thinking, we're going to have a problem. Now, when you've got a decent level of flexibility, you're obviously going to continue to stretch to improve yourself as you keep going throughout your journey of training. But once you've attained that level, which is relatively easy, there's going to be other things that are going to be influencing the way you move. You will more than likely have a natural proclivity towards one side of a pole, but in order to really kind of reach your highest potential, you're going to need to work upon the areas that are not so natural to you in order to improve those and bring them up to a similar sort of level. Now, I'm not saying you can't have your preferences. Obviously, there's going to always be certain things that you want to do and have sort of preferences towards, but be flexible and adaptable to know where you need to change. And this is how real like high-level athletes train, is they kind of understand where their weak areas are and they spend time on them, even though it's uncomfortable and not really enjoyable, because you might be kind of stumbling all the time, or you're just kind of clumsy while you're learning something. So most people don't really want to do this though, because it doesn't feel great, and it's like when they start to actually push those limits and kind of, you know, train things that are not as comfortable for them, the brain doesn't reward them as much, and it starts to make them feel kind of pretty shit about what they're doing, so they'll just kind of fall back into old habits and back into that comfort zone again and not really grow. And what I'd recommend here is that before jumping to conclusions about what's going on with your own kicks, firstly is to film yourself, then examine closely the technique of somebody doing the move who you consider to be good at it, and kind of compare yourself against that person. So let's now have a little bit of a technical breakdown of a side kick, and this is a kick that often people struggle to know how to get all of the right elements in place to make it kind of work correctly. So when looking at a side kick or when training it, it's easy to assume obviously that you need a super high level of flexibility, especially because it's quite an iconic kick that you often see photographs of and things where people are doing it really high. But unless you know those kind of little things that are going into it, it's going to almost be impossible to be able to perform it like that or anything close to that. One of the main things that you tend to see people do, again going back to this pivoting of the foot issue, if this isn't into the right position when you're starting the whole move, the rest of it's going to go off. Now, watch what happens with my foot here. I tend to move it in different stages as the kick happens. So we'll call this the beginning stage, which I've already kind of turned it slightly as I begin. So I'm in my forward facing stance here. As I begin the kick, I already turn it 45 degrees, so I've done a little bit of the work straight away. Then as I lift the kick into the chambered position, say we'll call this position number 2, I've then turned it about 90 degrees sideways. So that's half of the pivot in position complete already. Then as I extend the kick, the pivot happens fully, and it's fully facing the heel towards this direction and the toes facing towards this direction. And just to go back again, because there's something important to view here. And this is one of the things here that people often tend to go wrong with as well, is when they do kick out on their side kick. If you see my body in this type of position here, or even maybe here, often people will side kick from this position and their foot will be here, and they will side kick out like that with their body still kind of facing forwards, which is, you know, still valid. But watch what I do with my body, which makes it much more powerful, is you almost turn away from the kick like this. And that creates this nice stacked position of your weight along the whole of the body, which really, really amplifies the power of the technique. And there's a really good clip of Joe Rogan talking about this and trying to teach it to somebody on his podcast who was struggling to understand it. And so if you want to see that clip, search for something like Joe Rogan's sidekick.
I'm not stretched, that's why.
You have to put your knee up higher. It has nothing to do with stretching. It's just, you just haven't thrown a sidekick in a while.
Now extend, extend, straight. Don't look over your stomach, look over your shoulder. Like this, like that. That's how you look.
So yeah, as I lift this knee up here, I'm turning over the shoulder, almost looking like over my right shoulder, so you can see my face is actually behind the shoulder here, and I'm looking at the target of the kick. Then as I bring this back up as well, I'm nice and on balance as I'm able to reset the equilibrium of my weight coming back up, and then dropping down nice and lightly without slamming my foot down, which is another issue that you often tend to see people do, is they'll go from this position and then they will tend to slam this leg down into the ground and then they'll all of their center of gravity will be forwards. So this is essentially the side kicking technique. If you've understood this first part and are able to do it well, then all of the other things you do, like any stretching or any exercises to increase your strength and explosiveness, are only going to make that better. However, if you were to do those without understanding this kick, it's not going to really matter. You don't want a crappy explosive kick, you know what I mean, or a super high kick with poor technique. It's about having the technique first and then being able to build on it after that. Thanks once again, guys. I hope this video is useful for you, and if you have any questions, don't hesitate to send me a message on any of my social media links, and also be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel, as I'm going to start to be creating a lot more content on there, as I mentioned in the last video. Thanks very much, guys, and I'll see you next time.